picking up where we left off in the last recap video, which, if you haven't seen it, I recommend you check it out. I had just broken 2100 in the Amateur Team East, and I didn't really play again for about a month until I decided to play in a club tournament. There is this chess school in northern Jersey called the International Chess Academy, and they were hosting what is called, or what they were referring to as an open championship, basically just a 3-round Game 60 tournament for 1,600 plus players. There were only about 16 participants, but there was a couple of masters, and I was maybe the third or fourth highest rated player. So I decided to come play, maybe get some good training games in, and I won my first game against a 1,600. And so in the second round, I get thrown in against a pretty experienced player, actually, a master. At the time, he was rated only about 2140, but he was rated as high as 2,300 just a few years ago. So he has been kind of on a bad run of form, but he's definitely a very experienced, very capable player. And so game starts off e4. He plays c5, the Sicilian, and actually, because I played in the same tournaments as him a few times, I've seen the fact that he plays the Sicilian, so I was expecting this. He plays knight c6 on move 2, and when you see knight c6, usually you're thinking, okay, maybe Sveshnikov, maybe classical Sicilian, could transpose into maybe a 4 knights or Taimanov. But he plays this move, queen to b6, which is actually quite a rare Sicilian, but one which is rather dangerous. It's called the Godieva variation. And when I checked the database, actually, I was surprised how well black scores here. A lot of strong players have employed this line. I don't know what it is about it. Like, the engine says white is comfortably has an advantage and everything, but it's rather tricky to face. And I knew it was going to be a challenge. So, because the knight's under attack twice, it drops back. He attacks the pawn. I defend it. And now the most common move, usually what people play, is they'll play e6. And after bishop d3, black could bring out the bishop, but more traditional Sicilian approach is a6. And I've faced this opening in blitz a few times before, and usually what I'll do is just kind of, once I kick the queen back, I'll castle, and maybe like play f4, maybe play a4 to stop him from playing b5. But for some reason, I think it was because a few days before I was doing some analysis of another Sicilian line in which you long castle, so I was just kind of focused on like the approach of going aggressive and long castling. And so in this position, I chose to play queen f3 and long castles, and he immediately goes for b5, right, because he knows he has to get counterplay in before I can launch my own attack. And now I played the move king b1, just a little prophylactic move, tucking the king away can never hurt. And he plays bishop b7, and now what am I going to do? Well, it's time to expand on the king side, so I played g4. Right? Idea is, if I can play g5, I'm going to kick his knight back, and then I might just start rushing the pawns down the flank. He plays the move knight d7, and he basically played this very quickly because he was already anticipating that I was going to attack his knight, and it became apparent to me that he was very comfortable here because he's obviously played this before. And just in general, I knew that he was a pretty quick player, so he was already starting to develop a time advantage. I knew I had to keep up with him on the clock, this being game 60 time control. It's not, like a real classical game where you have 2 hours, so you have to really manage your time especially well. So I decided to just play g5 here, thinking like, I was going to attack his knight anyway, so I might as well push the pawn, gain a little bit more space on the king side. And he now played knight to b4. So he is starting to kind of probe my queen side, attacking the bishop. And this is where I started to make a little bit inaccurate moves. I decided after a little while to play rook c1, which has proved to be too passive. What I also considered was queen h3. Idea being that if he takes my bishop, I'm just going to take with the pawn, and now I can maybe use the c-file to my advantage. Right? Like maybe I can put this rook here and put this rook here. What I also, actually, what I didn't think about but should have would have been to drop the bishop back, because this preserves the bishop. I was just thinking, just let him take it, whatever, but actually preserving the bishop is pretty smart because that bishop can still be useful in the future. And there is this little tactic to watch out for. He can try this knight sacrifice, Idea being that if king takes, he plays b4. But it really doesn't do all that much for him because I can play rook c1 and create a counter pin and win the pawn back, and I'm still very much in control here. But I decided to play rook c1 because I was kind of anticipating that he was going to play rook c8 and bring some heat to the c file. So when he did, I was thinking, okay, I have to kind of act quickly, right? Because if I give him time, he's going to assemble a queenside attack. So I need to somehow put him under pressure and perhaps take advantage of the fact that he hasn't castled, right? A lot of times in these Sicilians, black feels that their king is actually safer in the center behind these pawns, and with the minor pieces protecting it than if the king were to castle. So I play the move queen to h3 with a subtle, tricky plan behind it. So let's say that he plays a random move, like let's just say hypothetically he sits around. What my queen is doing on h3, it seems kind of odd, like I'm blocking my pawn, which I might think about pushing, but I'm pinning his pawn on h7 to his rook, and I'm pressuring the pawn on e6. And the idea is that I will now play the move g6. He can't take with h-pawn. If he takes this way, then I can actually snag this pawn here, and that is a major breakthrough. Now I'm severely weakening his king position. So I was thinking maybe he'll play g6 to stop me, but then, he gives me maybe incentive to play f5. Same thing if he castles. I can maybe bring a rook to the g file and pressure him. But he decided to just continue with his plan. He played knight c5. What I should have done at this point was just stopped and focused on his move, really thought about, like, okay, is he really threatening anything over there? It doesn't seem like he is at first. I mean, he is attacking my bishop twice, but if he takes it, he helps the c file open up, which I can kind of use to my advantage. Right, like for example, if he were to make these trades, I would then have this little idea, knight takes b5, with a double attack against his queen. So I wasn't really too worried about the bishop, so I thought, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and play my idea with g6. However, instead of taking the pawn, he takes my knight, and I even throw in this move, and basically force his king out to the open, so it looks like, I succeeded, but then I have to take the knight. And already by this point, I realize that there's a problem, because he plays the move queen a5. And it becomes apparent to me that I have let him create a big series of threats on the queen side. Because with the queen being on a5 and the a file being open, he has a very straightforward but very dangerous threat. And that is to sacrifice the rook for the knight. Because if he can get rid of the knight would no longer cover the a2 square, and he has a checkmate threat. Now, if we go back to this position, instead of rushing with g6, if I had just taken his knight, then I would be totally fine. Like, I could just play bishop back, or even play, like, rook f1, but probably just save the bishop would be better, and then go for f5, I'm comfortably better. Like, I just have a very nice position, and I'm not really in too much danger. But instead, I allow him to start getting this attack, and then I'm sitting here like, wow, I have to be really careful now. I'm hanging on by a thread. What I have to do at this point is I have to move the rook from c1, because that's the only way I can give my king enough room to not get checkmated. But the question is, where do I move the rook? I thought for a little while, put the rook on f1, thinking that, okay, I'm going to play the move f5 and get at his king. And he actually could have still sacrificed the exchange here, and then given this check, taken this bishop, and, we were both looking at this in our heads. Here, though, he would have to choose between basically three moves. Taking the pawn, right, which looks very nice, bringing the rook to the c-file, or the move bishop f6. And, like, all these moves have their pluses and minuses. I think I was most scared of this one, but in a lot of these variations, I underestimated this defensive move for myself. I, for some reason, didn't see it in my head when I was calculating. But this is a good position for the bishop because it both defends and it sort of attacks at the same time. With bishop f6, though, it turns out this was his strongest move in this position, threatening the pawn. And it's not easy to defend, right? Because now I don't have bishop d4 because he'll take and then bring in his rook, and I am a dead man, basically. And if I play this move e5, basically this was kind of the defensive resource I was intending. Basically saying that if he takes, he exposes this pin on his bishop. But the problem is that he has this really annoying move, bishop g2, which hits my queen and both rooks. And then he can take this rook in the corner, and I can't take back because he has this skewer picking up the rook. And if I take here, he can just play g6, and I can't get to his king. And so, like, I'm sitting in this position. King looks very open. Can't take the bishop. Doesn't look good for me. Now, if we go back to this position, what it turns out is that the best place to move the rook was actually to g1. Not to f1, but to g1. And the difference this makes is actually huge, because if we go down the same line, now when I play e5, he doesn't have this bishop g2 move. He can take the rook, but now I can take his bishop, and I start to get more counterplay because my rook is on the open file instead of on f1. So this little subtlety ends up making a big difference, actually. And basically, when I checked with the computer, it was saying that after this, or maybe it was a slightly different line. I think, yeah, here, it was saying that his best course of action is just to go for a repetition. Just keep giving checks, and it should be a draw because neither of us, it doesn't benefit either of us to risk too much. But anyway, when we go back to the game, bishop f6 he played. Here is where really the most critical moment of the game happened, because I know what his threat is, right? He's attacking the knight, and I have two choices. I can play kind of the safe defensive move, bishop back to d2, trying to keep the knight under control, trying to kind of buckle down on defense. Or I can go for the more active but much higher risk move, e5. And I thought for a while, I thought about bishop d2, I said, okay, he's going to take, and then he's going to sack the exchange, and then he's going to give this check, and then he's going to take my bishop, and then he's going to play rook c8. And this looks really scary, once again. This pawn, very hard to protect. This pawn is also hanging. I really didn't think I was going to survive this. But if we look at this position closer, what I failed to realize is that I can very simply just take here with the queen. I was just so focused that I'm going to take with the pawn. I didn't realize that when I play this move bishop d2, some moves back, it opens the rank for my queen, and that makes a huge difference because this position is completely winning for white. Black has no threats because with this pawn still being on c2, I can just hide my king on d2, and I am totally fine, right? I'm up a rook for a bishop. So because of that miss, and because I wasn't feeling confident in defending that position, I decided to make a huge risk and play e5. Thinking that, he can't take because, again, he opens up the rook, and if he takes my rook in the corner, which he can also do, now I take this and I try to go for a counterplay. Maybe I bring in my queen. However, though, he sees his opportunity in this position and he sacked the exchange. He didn't need a second invitation. And now, the position goes to complete madness. I take the rook. He gives check. He takes. And again, I was thinking, if I take, he's going to either take this pawn or he's going to snipe the rook in the corner. And then he can do all kinds of annoying things. He can fork me. And I really didn't like any of this. Maybe I can survive this somehow with a draw, but I wasn't feeling confident in defending that position. So I came up with the genius idea, king to d2. Because I realized that his queen, when it's on a2, it's actually quite short of squares. And it looks like I might be able to trap it. So suddenly he's in a position where his bishop is hanging, his knight is hanging, his queen is close to getting trapped. And so for a brief moment I thought, I might have just found myself a pretty nice resource. If I can get his queen, then I might be turning the tides of this battle, which was looking like it was going away from me. However, what I didn't realize is that he can quite simply take this pawn. And I played rook a1. He played queen b2. I played rook b1 thinking I'm going to trap his queen, right? Seems like that's it. No way out. And then he hits me with knight takes f4. And I realized that I messed up big time because before I get a chance to take my queen, he attacks mine. So if I take, he's going to take, and he has a knight and a bishop for a rook, and he has a bunch of extra pawns, and my rooks are looking just so stupid over here. This position is so bad. King is wide open too. Hopeless. So I take the knight, and again, before I get a chance to take his queen, he hits me with this check. And he's just in time to force my king away and take the pawn. And even though I am able to, I throw in a check, I save my bishop, but if we look at this position, he has a bishop and 4 pawns for a rook. And my king has absolutely no safety. Like, this king will not find safety for the rest of this game. And, I knew objectively at this point I was lost. He basically, he missed some opportunities to win in a smoother way, but he basically, took the pawn. I let him took it because I needed to activate the rook somehow, but what ensues is basically him just giving a bunch of checks, bringing in his bishops, and I resigned in this position after bishop h4 because he's threatening checkmate on g2, and I have no way out, basically. Unless I want to sacrifice my queen, but obviously that's going to lead to a loss. So, yeah, that game was definitely very interesting, a lot to learn from it, but some small calculation errors really cost me, and also kind of not trusting in my defensive abilities. The position looked very scary, but Engine was saying, like, it's really only slightly better for black, so maybe I should have tried to defend it, like, instead of going for active counterplay, but that's always a very tough decision to make, knowing what to do in that kind of situation. Anyway, that was the second round of that tournament. Third round, I defeated a player about 1900 with black, and so I finished with 2 out of 3, losing a couple of rating points, but managing to stay just above 2100. Now, the title of this video is The L Before the Win Streak, and as I mentioned, after losing that Sicilian, I beat someone in the final round of that tournament, and actually, a few weeks later, I signed up to play in my local club championship in West Orange, New Jersey, and in the opening round, I beat a 1200 pretty easily. In the second round, I beat a 2000, and in the third round, I beat an 1800. So I got 3 consecutive wins in 3 consecutive weeks. It's a kind of a once-a-week tournament. But between the third round and the fourth round of that tournament, I actually was planning to play in the tournament from which this game is going to feature, and that is a tournament called Open at Foxwoods. Now, Foxwoods is a giant resort in the middle of the forest in Connecticut, and it was the biggest tournament basically of the year to that point. I was signed up for the under 2200 section, and I signed up to play in the 3-day section. Now, the tournament is 7 rounds, so the 3-day section, basically you play 2 games of game 60, delay 10, and then the rest of your games are basically 90-30 with a sudden death 30-minute time control. So the first 2 games, round 1 I played against a kid maybe like 1800 or so, maybe high 1800s. Wasn't exactly a smooth win, but I did end up winning that game, put him under a lot of pressure at the end. Second game, I played against a kid of about 1950, and another very tough game, but I again managed to win. So I won those 2 short games, not in very convincing fashion, but I did get the dubs. But for the third round, and this is the first long game of the tournament for me, I face the number 1 seed in the section, a Dominican dude. His FIDE rating was about 2050, USCF high 2100s, and this is obviously going to be a much bigger challenge. So I open with e4, and we have another Sicilian, the theme of this video. And he plays the e6 Sicilian with a6, the con variation. I was expecting this because I managed to prep for him a little bit, but once I played bishop d3, I was expecting him to play kind of the standard line with either knight f6 or queen c7. He plays the move bishop to c5. It's known as the Polygaevsky variation. Hitting the knight, kind of funny enough, a little bit similar to the first game, except now it's a different piece attacking the knight. Knight goes back to b3, and here black has 2 options. They can drop the bishop back to e7 or to a7. He chooses a7, which is kind of the more aggressive route because the bishop stays pressuring this way. So I castle. And now the idea is I basically want to get rid of that bishop because it's just too annoying to let him keep it. So I play bishop e3, we trade, he brings out his knight, and now I go for basically like a Maroczy bind setup with pawn to c4. Now, at any moment, I was kind of wary of the fact that if he really wanted to, he could go for my bishop, attack it, because, if I slide back, he gets the move knight c2 in with a fork, so that's not very pleasant. But what I realized is that it's not really worth it for him to do this because I'm just going to play a rook d1, and if he takes, well, now he has to deal with the tremendous pressure against the pawn on d6. And we looked at this after the game. He told me he wasn't really even considering going for the bishop, but that's sometimes, you have to kind of be aware of certain things that could arise. He just played queen c7, though, and then he played bishop d7. And at this point, I started to use a lot of time because I was aware that he might try to play knight e5 to go for my c4 pawn. And so eventually, I played the move rook c1. And he played knight e5, as I was kind of expecting. And this is where I spent a very long time thinking, because the move I spent a very long time on was the move f4. And what I was calculating is that what happens after he takes this? So at first, it seems like I'm just going to take and then play this move knight to d5. And this looks really nice. Double attack. I hit his queen, and if his queen moves, I can jump the knight into c7, fork his king and rook, so that looks excellent. Problem is, though, he has a very strong defensive resource, which is simply to take the knight. Because I'm not in time to take his queen, he's going to take mine. And if I take like this, I'm down 2 pawns now. And, okay, maybe I can play rook d1 and win the d6 pawn back, but he will eventually castle, and I didn't really get much in return. So I realized it wasn't going to be so simple, so then I started thinking, maybe I can play queen g3 here and target the g7 pawn while getting my queen out of the way. And I was looking at a lot of different lines, such as, if he castles, now I go for this. But in this line, I again missed something, which I didn't realize until after the game. I missed this move, knight takes e4 now. And now if I take his queen, he takes my queen, and just this huge liquidation ends up happening, where, again, he manages to come out up a pawn, maybe slightly better. So in this position, what it turns out, though, I was so focused on knight d5, what I didn't realize during the game is that I can just simply play rook to d1 instead of knight d5. Just rook d1. Very simple move, pressuring the d6 pawn, and he's actually in huge trouble now. Because now I'm pressuring his d6 pawn, and if he ever wants to defend it, right, he has to play queen b4. Because if he stays on the c file, now I will play some knight move, right, where I basically double attack him. But if he plays queen b4, I can just hit him with e5. And this is just devastating. His position is falling apart. Because after he moves his knight to g4, I just play queen g3, and he basically can't save his knight, because if he ever moves back, I take here and fork his rook and knights. So it's just crazy how I spent so long thinking about different tricks here, and I didn't see just this very straightforward move. So that's a little bit frustrating, and what's even more frustrating is actually the fact that I spent all my energy looking at knight takes pawn, when it turns out the move really to be worried about is this one. A move I didn't even think about at all. But what happens is, when I move the queen, he now can take and then hit me with this annoying check. I basically would have to give up a pawn to block, right, because I don't want to allow this fork. And, okay, objectively, I might not be worse here. Maybe it's about equal, but it's no good. Basically, it means that f4 doesn't work. And so, funny enough, I played rook d1, thinking that f4 doesn't work, but for the wrong reason. But anyway, I arrived at the right move. This is good, what I played here. I'm centralizing my pieces. And he now decides to go aggressive. He plays the move knight to g4. And this move caught me a little bit off at first, because I was like, really? He's attacking my queen. But then I realized that I have to be very careful, because if I put my queen, for example, here, he can play h4 and try to start putting me under big pressure. And if I go back, I have to watch out for certain ideas, like potentially him playing d5 and having some discovered attack ideas against this pawn. So I thought for a very long time, actually. I got already down to about half an hour, and I played queen to d4, which is actually a very clutch find. And this is a move he told me after the game he didn't even see this was possible. Because it seems like knight c6 actually traps the queen in the center, but the problem is I can take here. So it doesn't work for him. So I get to centralize my queen, and he can't attack it, and he was basically in the mindset that he wanted to go for an attack, right? kind of a dubious decision because his king is still in the center, right? He hasn't castled, but he started rocking back and forth in his chair and really getting deep into thought, and he played the move king to e7, like indicating that he's going all in because there's no going back from this. He's putting his king in the center, he's not castling, but it's actually not that easy for me to attack him because he has the d6 pawn well protected, there's no open files. So I simply brought my bishop back at this position, I attacked his knight, he plays h5, right? So we know he's going all in. And so I'm like, all right, if you're going to try to attack me on the flank, I'm going to try to break you down along the center. So I play c5, right? Because I have to open things up and get at him. And he basically has to take, right? Because I'm threatening to take on d6. So he takes, and I take with the knight. And I'm attacking his bishop, so he plays bishop c6. Now, objectively, this position is very good for me. My pieces are all pretty well positioned. His king is in the center. But I'm constantly aware that he has certain sneaky attacking ideas. Like, let's say I play a random move. He might hit me with this knight check. And I have to take with the bishop. And then his queen can come in and... Okay, in this position it doesn't work because once he gives a check, my king can just hide on e2. His attack basically fizzles out, but in certain variations, that attack can actually be quite annoying. So, in this position, it's funny sometimes, like looking back at a game, your thinking might seem strange at the time because you're so focused on certain ideas, you kind of lose your sense of objectivity. And I definitely lost my sense of objectivity here because if I had just stayed objective about this position, I would have been, okay, how do I just easily repel his attack? And if I had thought about it, I would have just played the move f4, kicking his knight back, and he can try to throw in an attack against my queen, but I have this idea where I can move the queen out of the way and line up a discovered attack threat where, for example, if he goes knight back, I can play this move, hitting his king with check and hitting his queen, and I would just be winning a colossal amount of material, game over. If he were to go back with the knight, then what I realize is I can take this pawn, and here there's a very nice knockout blow for white, taking advantage of his pieces being very misplaced, and that is the move knight takes e6. Just a filthy move. Hitting his queen, and if he takes the pawn, I have this skewer winning his queen. And if he takes the king, I can play f5 and just steamroll him down the center. I mean, his king is never going to find safety. I mean, it's over for him. Like, knight d5 is coming, queen takes g7 is a threat. I mean, he's busted. However, I didn't consider f4 at all in that position, and what I came up with was a very interesting but ultimately kind of a dubious move, and that is knight to d5. Because I was thinking, I'm sacrificing a knight, but when he takes it, and he basically has to take with his pawn, because if he takes the bishop, then, I mean, it doesn't do him much good. He takes the pawn. I take, and now I'm hitting his bishop, and at the same time, I'm threatening to play d6 and fork his queen and king. So it looks like a really good move on the surface. However, he plays rook to d8, pinning me, right? So now I can't play pawn takes bishop, and I can't play pawn d6 because he has that square covered. So I play queen b4, shifting my queen out of the way, and threatening again, knight takes a6 with a discovered check. He plays a5, driving my queen back, right? Now if I play knight a6, he's going to take my queen, and when I take his, he can rescue his bishop and be up a piece. So I have to go back with the queen. And this was kind of a very critical moment because he was getting low on time, and he was like very nervous because, you know, his king is in the center, but at the same time, he still has this idea on the cards. And as he was thinking, he was obviously calculating this, and I was calculating it too. And I wasn't sure how safe I actually am from this, because now when his queen comes in, he has this check with the bishop. And I saw that I can block and give a check, and his king has to go to f6, so I figured, okay, I should be fine here. Like, material is about even, but his king is a lot less safe. That's what I thought. Now, when we looked at it after the game, We also concluded that his king is unsafe, but maybe he has certain chances because he can kind of get his king out of the way, and maybe he can bring his rook in. My king has to go for a run. And then when we both plugged it into the engine, we found out that this position is better for black. And the engine says this position is like -1 or -2. So basically, it's saying that he definitely should have gone for this because he would have had good chances, even with the king being inexplicably safe on f6. However, in the heat of the moment, he kind of didn't trust himself to go for that line. I guess he didn't really think that it was going to amount to much. And so he basically folded. And he played the move king to f6, stepping out of the discovered attack. But now, I mean, he is done, basically. And plus, he got really low on the clock at this point. He got down to like 5 minutes from maybe 20. So I simply took his bishop, which engine actually says was not the most precise move, but I mean, I figured I'm winning a piece. And when he took back, I played the move f4. And he was like still kind of like shaking, trying to figure out what to do. And eventually, his time actually ran out. And so I called the fact that he flagged. The arbiter came over and said, yeah, like, I mean, your time's up. And so the guy, reached out his hand. And that was all. Game was over in 24 moves. I won basically by flagging. Kind of very anticlimactic finish because if we look at this position, it's totally hectic. Material is still about even, but I figured I'm just winning this because, if he moves the knight out of the way, I can attack his king. I didn't see exactly how I was going to win, but I mean, like, when a king is this exposed in the center, like, there's just no surviving this. Like, let's say king goes back, maybe I take this, maybe I can throw him a check, or I can take on g7. I mean, there's, like, obviously you have to be careful, but there's a lot of ways that white can win this position. So yeah, that was a wild game. I mean, like, I was very focused. I was very nervous during that game, as he was. Very action-packed 24-move game. But fortunately, I was able to win, and so I finished the first day of that tournament on a perfect 3 out of 3. How I did on day 2 of the tournament, we will resume in the next recap video. Thanks for watching.